Welcome to Climate Quickies, bite-sized nuggets of climate goodness from our TED experts in under 5 minutes. In this week's Climate Quickie, we hear from 22-year-old activist and good friend of TEDx London, Clover Hogan. Clover shares her own experience of dealing with eco-anxiety and how you can channel emotions of climate fear or panic into taking action over the things you can control. Let's head over to Clover to explain more. Enjoy and stay curious.
Yeah, so I start by saying, when we think and talk about eco-anxiety, it's easy to assume that it's a bad thing, right? That it's a weakness. And yet, eco-anxiety is not a clinical condition. And in fact, many climate psychologists would argue that it's the perfectly natural human response. In fact, they would say that the problem isn't that lots of young people are feeling eco-anxiety, but that more older generations aren't. And eco-anxiety suggests a high level of empathy, and it suggests that you are not numbing yourself to the state of the world and to the problems.
Right.
Obviously, we can't constantly be consumed by grief and fear and overwhelm. And yet we have to create space for those feelings because those feelings are what catalyze us to take action. Like if you reflect on a time when you've taken action on behalf of someone else or because you really believed in something, chances are that was because you experienced some injustice personally or you experienced injustice on behalf of another person and you said, actually, you know what, that's not the status quo, or at least it shouldn't be. That's not okay. It ignited that kind of fire in your belly or that irritation beneath your skin. And so as a society, we've gotten so good at numbing ourselves to the state of the world, pretending everything's okay, scrolling more, buying more, distracting ourselves from the issues. And yet folks feeling eco-anxiety are able to actually look at the state of the world. And eco-anxiety, as it's currently talked about, is obviously often through a bubble of climate privilege, right? Lots of young people responding to an anticipated threat. And yet you could use the same definition to describe what indigenous tribes have been going through for decades.
Right.
Frontline communities who've watched their homes, be destroyed before their very eyes. And the depression and anxiety that has ensued. There's a quote from an article I was reading recently from an Inuit elder saying, we are the people of the sea ice. What happens when there's no more sea ice? These are folks who are experiencing the loss of culture and land and identity. And so waking ourselves up to the reality of the feelings that are inevitable is a really healthy way of holding tension. And you touched on that earlier, Mariam. Whether you kind of need to be blindly optimistic or naively optimistic or kind of blindly despairing. And I think it's a matter of, holding tension between the two. I've seen that divide in, younger folks versus older generations and some of the business leaders I've worked with. Lots of young people feel so overwhelmed by these feelings and do not have a kind of outlet of agency, a clear sense of here's what I can do. When you just have the feelings without a sense of here's what I can channel them into, that's when it tips into the powerlessness. That's when it tips into I'm too small to make a difference. Yeah, if you have a clear sense of here's the problem that I want to take on, kind of unattached from expectation or outcome of that problem actually being solved, that's where you really find your power. And for the older generations, often their powerlessness shows up in that kind of denial of, technology will save the day or, young people will step up to the challenge, right? And so they need to get more in touch with their feelings. They need to create more space for that eco-anxiety and stop treating it as a weakness and start thinking of it as actually this is what's going to catalyze me to step up rather than shut down.
So almost like the feeling of eco-anxiety isn't necessarily a bad thing, or good or bad is a value judgment, right? But like it's not something to run away from. It should be an impetus for change. Yeah,
and it's kind of inevitable. Like I think for a long time, we touched on this at the start of the pod, Ben, where I was saying that I had started to feel like a caricature of myself, constantly being like very optimistic and hopeful and like peddling that message. And yet that all came crashing down in November of last year, when I started spontaneously crying. Mariam knows this story, but I was crying in the shower. I was crying on the way to work. I was crying literally in the tube, much to the horror of stoic British society.
Yeah, don't do that on the train.
And I wasn't experiencing, heartbreak from a boyfriend, but I was experiencing heartbreak of some kind, which was in response to the headlines that were rolling in from back home. So in November of last year, Australia was engulfed in flames. And I watched as friends tried to rescue their homes to no avail. I watched as 1 billion animals were incinerated in the fires. I watched as the very place that had forged me into this passionate environmentalist was incinerated, and I knew that it was never going to be the same. And I kept trying to make sense of the situation and say that I was okay, and my body was physiologically responding. It was going through this grieving process that I didn't want to happen, and so I had to acknowledge those feelings. Simultaneously, while the fires were raging, 100,000 people were displaced in Jakarta from the flooding, my second home. And so as climate change becomes more of a living reality, we have to get in touch with those feelings. It's not healthy to keep submerging them and to keep pretending that everything's okay. So we need to normalize the, creating space for these emotions and normalize this idea, as you said, Ben, that, there is no such thing really as a bad feeling or a good feeling. It's just about learning how to become emotionally adept and resilient enough that you can navigate it without completely losing your marbles.
Thanks for listening to this quickie.
This episode was created by our usual superstar podcast team and supported by TEDx London's headline partner, City. Until next time,
Stay curious.